Hi everybody, Mr. Rogers here with the second of my series of lectures on the colonial British North America. So in my first video, I talked a big overview of colonial America and the different regions, and I talked in detail about the South and about New England. For the second video here, I'm going to talk in detail about the Middle Colonies, focusing particularly on our home state here of Pennsylvania. And then I'm going to go into detail about what colonial slavery was like. And then I'm going to end a little bit with a summary of what you should take away from big picture from both of these videos. So let's jump right into it. So the Middle Colonies were made up by 4 modern-day United States, which is New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. So we've got New York up here. Here's us over here in Pennsylvania with Philly down over here. We've got New Jersey right here and Delaware right down there. All right. So unlike the South of New England, the Middle Colonies lack a lot of unifying themes or history. Several of the colonies, such as New York and New Jersey, were not even originally founded by the British. New York was originally founded by the Dutch, and the Swedes colonized parts of New Jersey, but also Pennsylvania and Delaware. The one main thing, though, that unites Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware's early history is diversity. The Middle Colonies were the most religiously, culturally, and economically diverse region of all British North America. And lots of different religious groups, from Quakers to Jews, Catholics, Puritans, Lutherans, Anglicans, Presbyterians, all these different groups of people settled in the Middle Colonies. Germans, Swedes, Dutch, French people, all of these different groups of Europeans, plus people of African descent, all settled in the Middle Colonies. Now, because of the diversity, though, of the Middle Colonies and the fact that it's really hard to say a lot of broad things about New York, which has a very radical different history than Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and the same is true for Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey and New York. I'm going to focus on just one of the Middle Colonies, which is, of course, our home state of Pennsylvania and our home city here at Yes Philly of Philadelphia. Now, Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers led by a man, William Penn, who you can see right here on your right. Now, Quakers were persecuted by the government back in England, and they actually got it worse than the Puritans, who, of course, were the ones, as I talked about in my first video about colonial America, that founded New England. Now, the thing is, Quakers believe, because of their beliefs, they believe very strongly in freedom of conscience, which means the freedom to believe whatever you want about religion, about politics, and about matters of the heart. And that leads to what separates Quakers from Puritans is that they actually allowed people who disagreed with them to openly settle in their colonies. So again, although they have a very similar background to Puritans, they were both Christian groups that were persecuted back in England, back in Britain. In fact, Quakers got it worse than the Puritans. But unlike Puritans, Quakers were actually willing to practice religious tolerance. They were actually willing to allow people who believed differently than them to live within their colony. And this policy made Pennsylvania a haven of diversity within British North America. People who were kicked out of other colonies could come to Pennsylvania, and religious refugees from Europe could come to Pennsylvania. And it makes Pennsylvania very unique. It's one of the most unique things about Pennsylvania, is that this Quaker policy of tolerance. Pennsylvania also had the advantage of time. Pennsylvania was founded after the southern colonies like Virginia and South Carolina, and after most of the New England colonies. So the Quakers who founded Pennsylvania and founded Philadelphia could learn from the mistakes that were made in the early settlement of those regions. And that gives them a big advantage. Pennsylvania also has an advantage, as if in many ways it's the Goldilocks of colonial climates. It's not too hot and it's not too cold. It's warmer than New England and cooler than the South. So it makes it much more of a desirable place to live climate-wise than most of the other regions of colonial North America. You know, it may not feel that way sitting today in in Philadelphia in the summer, but it's definitely preferable to being in Charleston in the summer, and it's definitely preferable to being in Boston in the winter. So Pennsylvania is much, much, much more mild in climate than the other regions. And because of all of this, the practice of diversity, the mild climate, the fact that they were able to learn from some of the early mistakes that were made by the other regions, Pennsylvania quickly became the fastest growing British colony. PA's population grew 4 times in just 6 years. And in 2 years after its founding, Philly had a population of over 2,000 people. Like New England, most settlers were families, and the economy was more about subsistence farming than in the South. But again, like in New England, they still grew things for market, they still grew things to sell, but it was also about growing crops for local consumption, for people growing food for themselves to eat and for their neighbors to eat. African slavery was also present in Pennsylvania. There were enslaved people of African descent or directly from Africa, but the economy was less based on it than in the South. So again, that's another commonality between New England and Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania and Native Americans. Peace between settlers and, initially, Pennsylvania had the best relations between European settlers and Native Americans of all the British colonies. Settlers were required in Pennsylvania to buy land from natives at a fair price. Initially. We'll talk about when this changes. And even William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, famously purchased the land for Philly and the initial settlement of Pennsylvania from its original inhabitants. In fact, relations between natives and European settlers in Pennsylvania were so good that some native groups that were pushed out of Virginia, that were pushed out of New England, ended up resettling in Pennsylvania initially because things were better. Because the culture, the climate was much friendlier to Native Americans than it was in their original homelands, and they couldn't survive in there with the pressure they were under from other settlers. But this peace between settlers and Native Americans in Pennsylvania did not last forever. Demands for land on all sides created tension. Native Americans wanted enough. The original Native Americans who lived in Pennsylvania wanted enough land to maintain their way of life. New Native Americans who were moving into the region wanted enough land for their way of life. And of course, white settlers wanted enough land for their way of life. So there's a massive demand for land. And that demand for land and the greed of European settlers eventually broke Penn's peace. Because eventually the demand of white settlers for the land that Native Americans were living in outstripped the willingness of European settlers to pay for it and the willingness of Native Americans to sell it. And the tragedy of Pennsylvania is in some ways its successful native relations at first was the origin of its eventual breakdown into violence and poor relations, because it encouraged Native Americans, different Native American groups to move into Pennsylvania. The peace between Native Americans and white people encouraged more white people to move to Pennsylvania, and this demographic surge on all ends leads to an eventual breakdown of relations between Native Americans and the white settlers. And of course, you have that fundamental thing that unites all 3 regions, which is, of course, the greed of European settlers for the land that Native Americans are living on. That greed in Pennsylvania eventually outstripped the willingness or ability of white people to pay for the land and the ability of Native Americans to sell, or willingness of Native Americans to sell it. And that leads to a breakdown in relations and to warfare in Pennsylvania, just like in the other regions that we've talked about. So overall, that's Pennsylvania. So in many ways, Pennsylvania is even more of a success story than the other colonies. It's got a more peaceful origin. It has a more mild climate. It grows faster than the other colonies do initially. It has much less death than in Virginia, much more tolerance than in New England. But Pennsylvania is still part of these structural inequalities and structural exploitation that unites all of the colonies in British North America, which I'll return to in a moment. But before that, I want to talk about the fundamental form of exploitation that is existing within these colonies, which of course is colonial slavery. Big picture, and you can see on the map on the right, all the colonies in British North America practiced slavery during the colonial period. Africans, African Americans, and Native Americans were enslaved by European colonizers. By the American Revolution, the overwhelming number of slaves in North America were of African descent, but Native Americans were also enslaved throughout the colonial period, and of course, some African Americans were the descendants of African slaves and Native American slaves. So those three groups, though, were the number one, number two, and number three groups of people who were enslaved. Now, most African slaves were forcibly brought to British America from Africa. Most African Americans were either born in the colonies or forcibly brought from the Caribbean, like Jamaica. And then, of course, Native Americans were enslaved through wars with European settlers. Now, the key thing, though, about slavery in this period is it was very regional. There were big differences between how slavery operated in the North and how slavery operated in the South. So there's two fundamental truths about colonial slavery: that all parts of British North America practiced slavery. No one was innocent. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, they were also implicated in slavery alongside Virginia and South Carolina. But that's not to say slavery was the same everywhere. So now I'm going to turn my attention to specifically what was slavery like in the northern states. And what I mean by the northern states are these are the colonies of both the New England region and the Middle Colonies. Now, the North was what historians call a society with slaves. Slavery was not the dominant form of labor, but it was present and important in how economic and social life worked in the North. Now, most slaves in the North lived in urban areas. Slaves worked as farmhands, artisans, teamsters, and servants. There were plantations, like I'll talk about in the South, but there were more slaves living in urban areas, in towns and cities, and they were working as farmhands, artisans, teamsters, and servants. Most slaves lived in a household with few other slaves, which could be very lonely. You generally could be the only enslaved person in your household, the only enslaved person that you saw for 90 or close to 100% of your day and your week. And that leads to little opportunity for community with other slaves and or Africans and African Americans. Now, most slaves in the North were enslaved by the wealthy because, again, it's not as widespread as it is in the southern states, or southern colonies, excuse me. Having slaves was seen as a marker of one's wealth and power in the North. So, in fact, the richer you got, the more you were encouraged to participate in slavery because you were seen as being rich and powerful because you owned slaves. Whether that was always true or not, it was one of the ways that you could show your neighbors that you were wealthier than them, that you were doing better than them. So again, slavery in the North was much more urban than what we'll talk about in a few moments when we talk about the South. Slaves worked as farmhands, they worked as butlers, they worked as maids, they worked as cooks, they worked as artisans, teamsters, and servants. Now, it's important to understand on a fundamental level before we move to the South, though, that despite not being the major form of labor, slavery was important to the economic and social life of the North. So again, it's a society with slaves. Slavery is not the fundamental feature of the society, but it's still really important, and it is an important economic aspect of Northern society. Now, for this part, talking about slavery, I've divided the southern colonies not in half, basically. Well, not really in half. Well, in size in half, but in numbers, not necessarily in half. But so the upper South states, or colonies, of Virginia and Maryland are the first ones I want to talk about. These upper South in the colonial period, most of the slaves there grew tobacco, and most of the slaves worked in the fields, but some were teamsters and craftsmen like in the North, but the overwhelming majority were working in the tobacco fields. Now, slavery was common on both small farms and large plantations. So slaves worked for both rich people and poorer people in the South. Now, a poor white person might own only 1 or 2 slaves, while a rich person owns hundreds. But it was much, much more common for white people throughout the social system in the South, the upper and lower South, to own slaves. Now, slaves in the upper South labored under what's called the gang system. Now, this system was very supervised and regimented, which means you had to follow a lot of different rules when you were working. And you worked in small groups. And because it was so supervised and so controlled, you had close contact with your enslaver. And because it was so supervised, so regimented, so controlled, slaves had little break from work during the day, and they worked from sunrise to sunset. And they generally had no free time during the week. They generally could only have time off on Sundays and some religious holidays. So this gang system, growing tobacco, was highly supervised, highly controlled by white people, whether it was by 1 or 2 slaves working for a poorer white person or hundreds of slaves working for rich white people. They were highly, highly controlled. And there's lots of close contact between the owners, the enslavers, the masters of slaves, and the slaves themselves. And because of this highly controlled, highly regimented system, slaves had little respite from their work, few breaks. They had to work from sunrise to sunset 7 days a week or 6 days a week. And they generally only had those Sundays and some religious holidays off from work. So, TLDR, the labor under the gang system was steady and unrelenting, but the climate and living conditions were better than the next region we're going to talk about, the lower southern states. So, again, the colonies of Virginia and Maryland, what I'm calling the Upper South here, was all about tobacco. Most slaves worked in the fields, and it was common throughout society. And people labored under a gang system, which was tightly controlled, tightly regimented, with few work breaks for enslaved people. That brings us to the next region, the Lower South. These are the colonies of North and South Carolina plus Georgia. Slavery began with Native Americans in this region, but transitioned to African slaves growing rice and indigo. So initially it was Native Americans who were enslaved in this region, but it transitioned to African slaves growing rice and indigo. Slaves in this period, in this period, worked in what's called the task system, where they were given a set number of tasks, which was daily or weekly goals, with no clear limit on working. So slaves were told you need to do 20 different things, 30 different things, but they weren't saying you have to do this on Monday, this on Tuesday, this on Thursday, this on Friday, this on Saturday. They were allowed to complete all of their work on Monday, if they could get it all done, or all on Tuesday, or all on Wednesday, or all on Thursday, as long as the work was done. So what this leads to is slaves having some say over how they spent their day. This creates a concept of master's time versus slave's time, where there was a clear delineation between, for enslaved people, this is my time, and this is the time I'm going to be spending on my tasks from my enslaver. Now, because of this, enslaved people had time to cultivate their own small plots of land on plantations, so they could grow their own supplemental food beyond what they were getting from their enslaver. And it also created greater opportunities for community among the enslaved and less interaction with white people. Because they weren't constantly supervised, and white people were, as long as that work was getting done, was willing to give people much more latitude about what was going on, enslaved people were able to develop their own community, were having more interaction among themselves, and much, much less interaction with their enslavers. So, TLDR about the task system. The task system led to terrible working conditions and shortened lifespan for enslaved people, but gave them more independence within that system. Because, again, the worst climate conditions were in the Carolinas and Georgia, but they were given some more independence and some more ability to set their own day than people in the Upper South. So the Upper South had better climate. You were sweating less, but you were much, much more regimented, much more controlled. In the lower South, things were much more dangerous. The working conditions were much rougher, but you had much more independence in how you went about your day and how you went about getting your tasks done for your enslaver. So we've talked about, in the first video, we gave a big overview of each region. Then I broke down what the South was like. I talked about what New England was like. In this video, I've talked about the Middle Colonies, and I've talked about the features of colonial slavery. What is the big picture that you should be taking away? So again, there's 3 regions: the South, New England, and the Middle Colonies. In the South, slavery was the dominant social and economic force, and there was a massively unequal society in the South because of it. New England, on the other hand, was a society with slaves rather than a slave society. And New England was set up along religious lines and highly intolerant of those who did not practice those religious lines. The Middle Colonies were the most diverse region. Again, we talked about religious diversity. We talked about background diversity. More diverse groups of Europeans were moving to the Middle Colonies. And also, like New England, the Middle Colonies were a society with slaves rather than a slave society like the South. And then, even bigger picture than that regional perspective, all regions of British North America were united in their success being the result of exploitation. Slavery was a feature of all societies. Native Americans were a target of exploitation and destruction by European settlers, and Europeans sought to reshape North America in their image. So this history of exploitation is fundamental to all of British North America, not just the South, not just New England, not just the Middle Colonies, but all of British North America. So hopefully that summary provides you with a clear overview of what you should take away. Make sure you check this against your study guide and make sure you're answering the questions. Please, if this is the second part of the video and you missed what's going on the first part, please go back and take a look at the first part of the video, or the first video in the lecture series, excuse me. And please stay safe, stay healthy.